Welcome, everyone, to Macro Social Work Stories, where the voices, lived experience of social workers are lifted as we have a conversation. And we're excited today. My co host, Dr. Steve Burghardt. Again, my name is Dr. Gary Jones, and we have the opportunity to provide the lived experience of social workers as we look at certain issues, to challenge them, and we uplift them in that process. Today, we're going to talk to Dr. Steve as we look at his new book. He's an author of over 10 books. I didn't say one, 10 books and numerous articles throughout his lifetime. So we're going to look at his latest book. The latest book is entitled The End of Social Work, a defense of the social worker in times of transformation. And so we're going to look at how social workers and other helping professionals are oppressed and how we do the work, but many times we do not receive equitable pay. And so we're going to begin our conversation and we're going to ask a couple questions. So, what led you to write this book, the latest book, The End of Social Work?
Well, thank you, Dr. Jones. What happened was a while back, I got asked along with a friend of mine, Mike Fabricant, to do something to sort of look historically at what's going on in social work in terms of labor, work, pay, that kind of stuff. And we looked back and saw that in the mid 60s, social workers and nurses actually and teachers all got paid the same amount. And of course, I looked today, both Mike and I looked and said, whoa, what is it that happened here where nurses now who graduate with their masters could start at anywhere from 73 to $90,000. Teachers start around 58, 64, up to 80. And how could it be that social workers with their masters started often less than 40? So we wrote this analysis and looked at a whole bunch of reasons as to what could have led this demise of not the value of what social workers do, but the loss of income and the bad working conditions that people had. So we put this together and the piece got rejected. So that got me so angry. I said, "The heck with it! I'm gonna write a book." And I put together all the different issues that you and I have talked about before. I've talked about some of these before about the working conditions, the terrible salaries, the difficulty of what that means for how people live, the stress that this puts in people's lives. But today, one of the things I want to talk about is uh, social work academia and our own responsibility in this to what's led to some of the loss of stature in the field. If you have loss of stature, I'm not talking status, I'm talking stature, people perceiving us and social workers as doing amazingly important work, perceiving that what we do is of great worth, that's been diminished. So I think there's a few reasons. One of them, I don't have time to cite them all, but one I want to talk about is um, how could it be that social workers sometimes feel ashamed of what they do? There actually are studies that show social workers being studied for the degree of shame, how many are embarrassed to say what they do, and so on. And I thought, oh my God, here's another issue that really is not acceptable. How can people who work with the poor, marginalized, and oppressed be ashamed of doing that kind of sacred work?
Yeah.
And so, what I looked at is, in part, whenever there's a crisis, whenever there's something that happens, and somebody dies of homelessness, and child welfare, an isolated elder, uh, they often trot out a social worker or a couple of social workers as the problem and blame them with a new plan then put in place about how social work will be different. Well, what they fail to account for, and our schools need to be able to do a better job about, is that ever since the 80s, um, neoliberal policy has starved the social welfare state in ways that have led nonprofits to be starved as well. And in that starvation, rather than analyze what the welfare state has done and where uh, politicians have put their money over the last 50 years, what they do instead, um, and with that, analyzing what's happened in the starvation of nonprofits, they simply talk about the nonprofits. And they talk about a nonprofit and, for example, the Academy of American Social Work and Social Science has all sorts of analyses of the welfare state, but does nothing to explain what that means for work or for practice. And then they do in their grand challenges go on to speak about a number of challenges of what social worker ought to do better, could do, blah, blah, blah. All of which
Yeah.
are wonderful
Yeah.
ideas, but only if they get the level of funding they need. And we in the academy have to take responsibility for this.
Yeah. So, number of common themes you highlighted. The time, the 1960s and 1980s, and how certain professionals, education, social work, and nursing, we were kind of equitable as ways to pay. But as we progress, we can see the differences between the different fields in that process. And so, you highlighted shame, social workers not really having the ability to tell the others what they do, because many times society has a perception on what social worker is, and we have this perception that we actually have a social welfare state in our nation, and so that perception, uh, and when we have the profession that they only place social workers with those who are poverty stricken. And social workers, we do more work with the affluent. We do a number of things. And so, as you looked at the end of social work and the academia, what are some things we could do to prepare our emerging social workers to challenge the structures? Many times, the structures have been around for a while, but how can we prepare our emerging social workers to challenge structures and entities that promote racism, that promote inequity and injustice? How can we prepare our emerging social workers
Right.
to address those issues?
Yeah. Great, great analysis and great question. I would argue that the first thing we need to do in order to fight the kind of systemic racism and economic inequality that's in our profession is that we have to train social workers to be proud of what we do, and that what goes with that, in that pride. You can't say you're proud of the work and then have people work in an agency where paint's coming off the walls, or where there aren't enough, literally sometimes there aren't enough paper clips, or there aren't enough, the lighting isn't well done. It, yes, so there's not enough money, and that's going to be a long-term fight. But to begin with, executives and leaders, as well as social workers at the front lines, have to say we deserve to have minimally good standards for how we work. We deserve, I'll give you another example. Social workers have a right to stand for good PPEs in today's world. Do you know that? I know you do know this, Gary, that all sorts of social workers all over the country were not given PPEs, even though they continue to work with the homeless, the elderly, child welfare, any number, as you said, any number of areas where people would work, and agencies would would provide only one mask. They wouldn't provide other items that people needed. And they said social workers had to pay it out of their already meager salary. So there's a mindset that we have to break, that we have to prepare social workers to not accept a mindset that says it's because we work with the people we do, that it's okay to take less. It's not okay. Um, so number one, we have to prepare, and that's number two. It's We have to allow people to say it's okay to work together collectively. That the answers to this are not simply self-care. You've heard me talk about this before. You do self-care, I do self-care. It's not an answer to burnout or to difficult working conditions. Social workers must be trained to that it is self-interest is not selfishness. Social workers must be trained that self-care is necessary if you're going to do this work, but it's insufficient to correct the problems that can occur inside an agency because of the starvation of the nonprofit sector. Social work academia has to train people on what that starvation looks like, so that we learn, as you said nicely, we have to learn to advocate on this. Well, we have to advocate the right way. Yes, of course, advocate for clients. And what the clients need and deserve is not that different from what social workers need and deserve as well. And we have to not be ashamed about that ever again. We have to not perceive it as selfishness. We have to perceive it as something that we need collectively and not individually.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Those are vital points as you look at a collective effort, collaborating. Self care in and of itself will not change working conditions. And so we have to demand better working conditions so that we could better partner with communities to bring about change in that process. There are a number of questions and statements that emerge from your book, and one of them looked at the demands on a social worker. Our code of ethics talks about the
Yeah.
fact that we should volunteer when other professions are paid top dollar to go to deal with crises. Talk a little bit about that.
Oh, that's a great point. The whole self-care thing is really what happens is people are told to do the self-care. They're told to stand strong on that when they're exhausted. Now, what does happen? There is secondary trauma. There is burnout. Um, there's been all this writing in CSWE newsletters and NHW newsletters that the answer to burnout and secondary trauma is what we do individually. And we know that not to be true, that it's just if you're so exhausted that when you arrive home, you can't do self care if you're too tired to be able to do it in the first place. So you're onto something. I mean, one of the things that happens for people is when they see the burnout, they think it's their individual problem. The individual problem, because the code of ethics, as you pointed out, defines in service that all social workers must do pro bono work, parentheses, not be remunerated, not be paid for it. Now, to put that out there in that language is really troubling because what it does, as you're suggesting, is it makes a person feel guilty if they say, I don't want to work for free. Now,
Mhm.
volunteering separate from your work is a very good thing. I
Mhm.
do it. I'm sure you do it. We all do it. Um, could do it through one's church, mosque, synagogue. I'm doing it with a social worker equity campaign. We all do it. But volunteering is a choice that the code of ethics puts in that service must include non remunerative, non pay work. Sets social work, frontline social workers, the new ones coming into the field, to feel selfish. So when people in the schools of social work teach this and they teach the code of ethics, they've got to point out its flaws and not present it as a perfect document because it's not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Welcome, Christy. I'm glad that you finally were able to get on.
Me too. For a while there, I just had a green screen, and anyway, I'm here. And it said my devices weren't connected, but I was connected. I could listen, and I even chatted in the but you probably didn't get it. But I had just commented there's self-care doesn't add more hours in one's day.
No, it
So
sure doesn't.
if you don't have
So,
time, you can't take care of yourself.
so and as I pointed out before, if we go to conferences and there are 18 workshops on self-care and one on working conditions, people in academia have got to change their priorities. They've got to be willing to do research on what working conditions are like. They've got to be willing, we've got to be willing to look at what does it take to create a humane work environment so that humanity can show up for the worker as well as for the client. And that's shame on us that if we don't look at these things in the coming years, because new social workers then fall back on what they've been told, and they find self-care doesn't work, so they change their job horizontally. They make a move, but they don't get better working conditions. They don't get better pay. Gary, you just pointed out a colleague and a friend of yours who's worked in the field for many years and is still making $40,000 a year. These things we in academia have to address, and not just the individual worker who isn't going to get an answer.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we look at the concept of working conditions and creating better environments for social workers, I remember speaking to one of my colleagues about the fact that if agencies society members want clients and services to be taken care of, you have to take care of their employees. If
That's
if
exactly.
if we it's a parallel process. If we provide a healthy environment for employees, those type of skills will be transferred down to those who provide the services. But if it's a working hostile environment where you're forced to work overtime
Hmm.
on a minimum wage salary, uh, it can be questionable. And so, like we're asking, like you said, we want to treat individuals humane, but we're not treating the providers in a humane manner as we partner with them in that process. And as
Don't
we
you?
look,
Oh,
go
sorry,
ahead,
Gary.
go ahead, go ahead, Chris.
Don't you think that if the managers or directors, whatever the title is, especially at our nonprofits, if they were able to answer the question, how many hours per week do your social workers need for meetings, period, on average, and they came up with that number, well, we'd have only so many hours left in a 40-hour work week to where you can expect them to complete their caseload. So you have to give, so if there's 5 hours a week or 10, we need to be realistic. How many committees are they on? Is it just the one meeting, not just meetings with you? So to cover all the meetings, how much time do we have left? So we can only assign X amount of clients per provider and have them not go over 40 hours a week. Not saying you're not working 40 hours a week, not going over 40 hours a week. And then they could actually
Yeah,
have time for the other things in their life to help retain them.
exactly. There's a quotation I have in the book that an executive was leaving work at 5 p.m. or maybe 5:30, and the receptionist, who had a nice relationship with this executive, said, "Hey, Miss B, you only working a half day today?" And
Mhm.
there's something wrong. There's something really wrong with this idea. And again, you both have heard me talk about this, that somehow he, she, or they who works is the most exhausted is the better person and the better social worker. Exhaustion is not a measure of excellence. It's a measure of exhaustion, body of a body at risk, of a mind at risk, of not being of putting people at risk whom we work with. So exhaustion is not something that any of us should ever be proud of. And yet it gets trotted out in schools. They will often talk about these incredible people who have worked themselves with those types of hours. And we have to, these are the things. Schools are socializing places. We socialize people to what they can expect, what's the best form of practice, what's the best way to be um, in the world and in the profession. And if what we hold out creates shame because they don't have an understanding as to why they uh, are, things don't work and failures do occur, if they're shamed over that, if they're thought to think that their answers are individual about self-interest rather than collective, if they're told that shame is more important to analyze self-interest than it is to analyze working conditions, um, and their code of ethics tells people that you better be willing to volunteer and work for free,
Mm,
not volunteer separate, but
Right.
implicitly the service. Nobody's against independent volunteer, but that it be part of your job is truly problematic. So all that culminates in people not being able to do the quality, critically reflective work that any professional has to do. All of which then, if you can't do really thoughtful, critical work, critically reflective work, the work won't be so good. We don't
Do
have to
we
pay them
even
so
have
much.
do we even legally have an option to volunteer at your place of work when you're a W-2 employee? I think that's actually illegal. So, I mean, that's why we don't use that term, but it's essentially what we're doing, right? Is
Yeah,
volunteering. Volunteering means outside of, it does not mean within.
that's a great point. Great point. It's really, this when you peel the onion, there's so many different layers to this. I mean, the inequity that all what this speaks to inequity that it becomes larger and larger, or rather more and more intense. And by inequity, I mean um, people are paid less and less, work harder and harder, and simultaneously, more and more people who enter the profession are Black, Brown, Asian, or are openly LGBTQ, um, which means implicitly and explicitly the structures being created that will now be filled by people that will intensify racism, sexism, and forms of homophobia, even though we profess social justice. But if we don't profess, we got to change these working conditions so that these new people entering the field get a level of dignity to go with what they're supposed to do in the field. We're perpetuating the same kind of implicit and explicit racial, gender, sexual bias that we decry from other parts of the society.
Yes, and as a profession, we profess a lot. Our books, our books know different pioneers. Uh, that's that many times did not provide a balanced perspective. Can you talk about some of those pioneers who we uplift, and then those who we need to uplift, who actually
Ah,
provide a balanced perspective on how they serve all vulnerable and resilient populations?
Great question.
great question. I mean, one of the things as I did my research on this, they talked about how the last 30 years there's been an absence of practice theory. That, really advanced thought that could be used both theoretically and operationally to advance practice. And they said, where are the Grace Coyles and the Gordon Hamiltons of the past? Well, it turns out that indeed there have been a couple of people who've done remarkable work of practice theory of great value for practitioners that continues in the pantheon of what social work is. But notice who's invisible. There are at least two works by two different women that are extraordinary in my career that I've read and one of whom I've met. The first was in the mid 70s. Barbara Pope Solomon wrote an amazing book called Black Empowerment. And for 3 years, I'd go to conferences and everybody went everywhere. There were more workshops on Black empowerment and how Black empowerment could help any area of the field. Well, by the early 80s, the book was on shelves, but it never did get used anymore. Now, of course, Dr. Solomon is an African American woman, very distinguished, has done amazing work, and yet it's not part of that pantheon. Likewise, the other brilliant work that I know of that's advanced theory is by a woman named Dr. Elaine Pinderhughes, who wrote a book on race, ethnicity, and power related to practice. African American woman out of Boston College. Her work was incredibly important. Uh, and she's won awards, but she's not part, both of them have won awards. It's always good to get an award. But it's more important that the work be used and seen as germane for all of social work. It's not just germane for, why is Grace Coyle's or Gordon Hamilton's work germane for any social worker to reconsider? But what? That the work of Dr. Solomon and Dr. Pinderhughes is what? For African Americans, but not for white people like me and Christy? I don't think so. And yet, implicit bias, explicit structural damage leads work to be marginalized and dropped, even though it continues to be of extraordinary value and worth. Anybody? So, great question. People are not only pioneers, but the American myth of who the pioneers were. There are all these pioneers, right?
Gary, I know you had some in mind. What was on your
Yes.
mind when you asked?
Yeah, so I remember reading a textbook when we talk about Jane Addams, who
Yeah.
provided work for the settlement houses and for immigrants. But there's a colleague who was around with her, Mrs. The Great, Ida B. Wells, who provided a more balanced perspective, who stood up for the rights of women, just like Jane Addams, but also looked at the experience of people of color. And so when they were looking at the voting rights of women, it was not always brought into the argument about how people of color who are women treated. And so the idea that we have to look at women's rights without looking at women of color, Ida B. Wells said no. Ida B. Wells wanted to bring a well-balanced perspective. And Ida B. Wells E. Franklin Frazier. I remember reading certain books by E. Franklin Frazier, who was in Atlanta, who really wanted to talk about racism. Well, because of that, he was pushed out of that territory because they did not want to bring about change in that process. And so that was some of the authors who I remember reading about at my studies, working on a PhD program. And I remember I was reading a text, uh, the Black Empowerment text, and it talked about the community involvement of Dr. Barbara Solomon and how she wanted to have a macro class, community class in a community. And she got pushback because she wanted to actually have the community to be about the process. And so even in 2021, we've had colleagues who have talked about taking it from the ivory towers, so to say,
Right.
and actually hearing the voices of those who we have to partner with as we bring about change. And I say partner because we can't save anybody as social workers. We can only partner as we move forward.
That's a great point. Ida B. Wells also had to educate Jane Addams on lynching. Jane Addams thought that initially didn't object to lynching. She objected that there wasn't a trial. And she assumed that the people were guilty. And Ida B. Wells had to educate her, which to Jane Addams' credit, she did learn. But she fell into some pretty easily horrible tropes and ideas along the way. What this speaks to, folks, I mean, obviously, with the intensity area of what you're speaking about, Christy, the issues that you raised, is academia has a lot to account for that we have to take responsibility for as well. There's no reason why people as brilliant and as important as Dr. Solomon and Pinder Hughes aren't continued to be taught and part of that pioneer pantheon. There's no reason for research not to be done on the actual conditions of people that work. There's no reason for us not to make clear that it's not a worker's fault. It's a systems failure in helping people with social policy. If we don't do those things, it generates all the more reason why MBAs and MPAs become executives. And that the answers all lie in greater efficiencies, all of which creates greater exploitation of the increasingly diverse workforce that we have. We're now speaking about diversity, equity, and inclusion everywhere. So what this is, we now have diversity and inclusion, more and more Black and brown, Asian American people, more openly LGBTQ. So there's diversity, people are being included, but equity is about income and wealth and dignity being equalized as well. And that will not happen. So come on in, folks, but don't live well, suffer at work, be diminished at work, have your dignity removed from you. Yeah, we need
Steve,
something else.
just imagine if you said MBA. So imagine when we put up our work ads for post grads and we see $40,000, $65,000, and you don't even glance at it because it's not the minimum that you would expect. It's half of what you should expect with that level of education. So you just move on. The budgets would have to have a revamp. They would absolutely have to have a revamp. They'd have to merge the agencies. They'd have to close. And I upset people when I say that part. But I don't think we should be operating if we can't afford to pay our workers. So we're just adding to the problem.
Well, we confront a number of issues that this will take 4 or 5, up to 10 years to correct. But if we wait, one of the things that people have said to me about this is like, it's the classic thing is, Martin Luther King, please don't hear me in any way remotely comparing myself to him. But Martin Luther King from letters from a Birmingham jail was addressed to white liberals who kept saying we should be more temperate, that the civil rights movement needs to be more modest. Well, how long, what he went on to say is how long? How long must people suffer? that moderation has not done anything. So sure, moderation sounds fine. We need to be why, but why? Related to this is acceptable? It's not. And so these conditions cry out for something that, yes, it will take years to correct, but it's not going to happen by being moderate about our analysis as to what the problems are and a willingness to risk a beginning to try to create the change.
Yeah.
And maybe we don't have to, because right now we're seeing a labor movement really right now because people can't fill jobs anywhere in restaurants or any sector. They're having trouble right now because people don't want to work for that anymore, whatever it is. And so they're being forced to raise wages. So if we don't take those jobs, then they're going to have to raise what they're willing to pay. And it takes walking away. And that part's hard, especially when you've just graduated and you're scared of your student loans. But there are other jobs in other sectors that may not require an MSW, but that might be where you need to go in the meantime until we can do better. So sorry to who I'm actually, Steve, one of my questions to you is how much hate mail have you gotten? Have you gotten any?
I haven't gotten hate mail, but I've gotten a lot of pushback from people who are friends. I mean, they're not friends, but I've definitely gotten pushback about, the complexity. The issue is much more complex than is being suggested. And what I point out about complexity can be an excuse to do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some simple truths that we've just spoken about that have to be addressed. And so to that end, as I know both of you know, we've created out of the book, a number of people asked that we create a social worker equity campaign that does something about this. And I certainly hope people, if you look up social worker equity campaign, we're getting a LinkedIn page. There's at the Action Network, there's a petition campaign. In less than a week, we've gotten over 250 names just right out of the gate, which speaks to the urgency of this. So if any of our listeners are interested, they can always email me, but we'll also, by next week, we're going to have a LinkedIn and Facebook page, social worker equity campaign. So stay tuned.
Yes. And so we just want to highlight your textbook, that scholarly work that you provided, the end of social work, a defense of social worker in times of transformation. And so we want to thank everyone for being a part of our time on today. And so until next time, please do what you can to look out for your community, look out for those the have-nots, and make sure their voices are lifted to bring about desired change. Thank you, and we'll see you in our next video.
So can we stay on?